Matthew chapter 13 still. Chapter of parables. Talked about the parable of the sower last time, and now on another agricultural story in verse 24, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Allergies. The kingdom of heaven, Jesus said, is this way. A man sowed good seed. What is good seed? Well, good seed is a seed that is what it, claims to be. It's not adulterated. It's not bifurcated. It is just that seed. Okay. Now, everything in a parable doesn't have a parallel, but some things do. I'm not sure what the seed represents except for people, okay? And the sower, this man who sowed good seed, I suppose that could be a Christian or a follower of Jesus, but I think more in the context of this, it's God. Okay, the seed gets planted, and then at night, an enemy comes in. Who is the enemy of God? That's easy. Satan. Everybody else is a victim of Satan or aligned with Satan, but Satan is the enemy. And he comes in and he sows weeds among the good seed. I'm not a farmer, but I know enough about farming that what you don't want is for weeds to grow up among your crops. It steals the resources and the nutrients out of the soil that should go to the good seed. Have you ever seen that happen? Sometimes it happens in churches where, people, sometimes they're just misguided. I think most of the time they're misguided, but they tend to take the resources to absorb. They have to be careful here because many of the needy people in any church are Jesus intended for them to connect with his church because that's where they can be best helped and nurtured and developed if they want to. And sometimes they want to. This is just my experience. They don't know how. Sometimes they emotionally want to, but in terms of their will, they don't want to change. They want to get better without changing. It's easy for me to throw rocks at people like this, but I got to be careful because I am one of these people. Well, the story goes on, and the workers notice that as the wheat grows up, the grain grows up, so did the weeds. So you get weeds in the stalks of this good seed growing up side by side. And their first thought was, let's pull up the weeds. But the owner said, no, because in that process you may pull up the good with the bad. It's just the way it happens. So leave them. And then at harvest time, we'll separate the weeds from the good, bad from the good. And we'll bundle up the bad and we'll burn it. This is, in some ways, I think of this as a pretty stern warning to God's people. There is good seed and there are weeds, okay? There are people who are sincerely in love with Jesus and engaged in as best they can in his design. And then there are people who are not. And they're sometimes sitting in the same pew. So whose responsibility is it to figure out which is which? Who are the good seed? Who are the weeds? Excuse me. One of the things I think Jesus was teaching here is it's not your job. You don't have to do that. In fact, don't do that. When the harvest comes, and in this context, what the harvest will be is the judgment. And at that time, it will be not your job to make a judgment. It'll be obvious. The bad, they will be destroyed. And the good, well, they'll be harvested. So it's a little bit of a end of the world scenario, end times scenario. But what's the point? It's a pretty simple point. Be good seed. And as you work with good seeds, you don't have to pull up the weeds. It's not your job. It won't serve the best purpose. So, okay, I'm getting from this two things. Number one, I'm going to test my motives. Am I a weed? And to be honest with you, there are weeds in my heart and life. And I am, with the help of God's grace, I really am doing what I can to get rid of those weeds, because I want the good seed of my life to thrive. Whatever I can do as seed to be the kind of seed that will flourish. I can do a few things. Okay, that's one aspect. And the other aspect is just a reality. There are good people and there are bad people. And sometimes they show up in the same church. So instead of me getting all bent out of shape about it, maybe I should just try to nurture the good seed and let God deal with the bad. Well, one last thing. Satan is always trying. He never gives up. Dropping in weeds among the good seed. Sometimes the weeds would be individuals, but more often the weeds are ideas and concepts and motivations. It's not my responsibility to start throwing rocks on this, but I will tell you this much. In what I can observe of the American church is not just only happening in America. It's happened already in Europe, and now is happening often, too often, among American churches, where our own comfort and happiness are the objectives of a relationship with Jesus. God wants me to be happy, doesn't he? Maybe you should consult Jeremiah on that. As a matter of fact, any one of the Old Testament prophets. And for crying out loud, maybe read up on Jesus' life. Well, one overriding big idea that I think is a primary weed that Satan is sowing into the good seed, the plot, which would be his church universal. And I'm not saying you gotta form a watchdog committee at your church. I'm just saying you be a seed and recognize the weed. But it has to do with, it's about me. It's about my prosperity. It's about my health. It's about my happiness. Happiness is not the end game. It's just a secondary byproduct. Because what God is after in our lives is the image of Jesus. That I would more and more every day become like him. I'm sorry, I can't keep. Anyway, our objective is to organize our life and habits around the nature and character of Jesus. And as we do that, by the power of God's Spirit, through the grace of God, it's not about I try harder. It's about I permit and partner with God's grace to bring about his character, Jesus' character in my life. And there are going to be times that brings supreme happiness and joy. But if I lose track of what's the real target, I mean, the weeds are gonna. I mean, that's what the weeds are about. And Satan is constantly sowing his weeds into, or he's attempting to sow his weeds into our lives. Now, in this parable, the seed, what does a seed do? It just grows. It doesn't fight off the weeds. It doesn't somehow do battle with weeds. It just grows. So maybe my objective, and yours too, if you choose to accept this assignment, is to just grow. Because I think that's God's design. So, well, that's the parable. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie.